Congressman Eric Swalwell has just announced that he is resigning from Congress. Let's go right to CNN's Manu Raji on Capitol Hill. Manu, what are you learning?
Yeah, this is happening very rapidly. Just moments ago, Eric Swalwell posting on X that he plans to resign his seat that he is occupied representing the Northern California district, and saying so in the aftermath of these very serious allegations of sexual misconduct, including an allegation of rape. He has denied these allegations, but indicating in this statement that all of this was too much of a distraction, he said, to his constituents, which is why he plans to give up his seat in Congress. Now, this statement I'll read to you, Anderson, says, "I am deeply sorry to my family, staff, and constituents for mistakes and judgment I've made in my past. I will fight this serious false allegation made against me. However, I must take responsibility and ownership for the mistakes I did make. I am aware of efforts to bring an immediate expulsion vote against me and other members. Expelling anyone in Congress without due process within days of an allegation being made is wrong," he said, "but it's also wrong for my constituents to have me distracted from my duties. Therefore, I plan to resign my seat in Congress." He goes on to say he'll work to ensure a smooth transition. But this is a dramatic downfall, Anderson. Swalwell was a frontrunner, a Democratic frontrunner for his party's nomination to be the next governor of California, battling out with several other Democrats in that race. But in the aftermath of all these allegations, he saw his support completely collapse. One backer after another withdrawing their support, calling on him to withdraw from his race for California governor. Ultimately, he did announce last night that he would no longer run for governor, but it was still a question about whether he tried to hang on to this seat, Anderson. But there was expected to be a vote this week to expel him, and a lot of Democrats were indicating that they would vote indeed to expel him from Congress. But a dramatic downfall from someone who rose to prominence as an anti-Trump Democrat, a leader to become the next governor of California, now plans to give up his seat among these very serious allegations of sexual misconduct. Anderson.
Manu Raji, Manu, thanks for the breaking news. I want to go straight to CNN's Elex Michaelson and Politico's California Bureau Chief Melanie Mason. They join me now. Melanie, let me start with you. I mean, first of all, what's your reaction to this breaking news?
I mean, I just keep thinking about what an incredible week this has been in this campaign. I mean, this time last week, I would say that Congressman, or I guess I should say former Congressman Swalwell, was poised to be the Democratic frontrunner. I think we were about to see that breakout for him. And look at what we have seen just in the course of the week. So the fact that this news is just breaking right now, that he is resigning, to me, it's just kind of underscores the whirlwind that we've been through out here in California over the last 7 days.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot think of a faster fall from grace in modern political history. I mean, over the course of Friday afternoon, in a span of about 15 minutes, he lost not only the support of, pretty much everybody in the party, but all of his best friends. Ruben Gallego, who had put out statements in the past calling Eric Swalwell his best friend in Congress, put out a statement late this afternoon calling for Eric Swalwell to be expelled. He lost his support over the weekend of his staff, all saying you should drop out. Even staffers who potentially could lose their own jobs in the process. So Eric Swalwell left with essentially no support from anyone in any direction. No support to run a campaign, no money, no organization, no message, and no support to even run a congressional office. And so right now, he's left with nothing and no job and potentially, Anderson, criminal charges.
And Melanie, what does happen now? I mean, there's a variety of allegations, some of them, criminal, others just, go to a question of character.
I think that when stories like this break, I think that the next question is will more people come forward? I in fact saw a news release coming out that we should expect a press conference tomorrow with somebody alleging that they were a victim of Congressman Swalwell. And so I do wonder if the dam breaks, if there are more women that come out and share their stories. But also I think that there's what happens now is that California still has to figure out who its next governor is going to be, and ballots drop here in just about a month. And so I think that as people here in California were trying to process this news about Swalwell over the weekend, they were also trying to understand the state of the race and trying to figure out, okay, who do we go to now? You know, most of the Democratic establishment, I would say, somewhat reluctantly coalesced around Swalwell over the last couple of months, and now I think that they're looking around and trying to figure out which iceberg to jump to.
Well, let's talk about the governor's race because, there's obviously this major gap now. As you said, it's on June 2nd. The field is crowded. Swalwell, as you said, was the front runner. But among them right now, billionaire Tom Steyer, you got former Congresswoman Katie Porter, the former HHS secretary, who was the former HHS secretary. You got the mayor of San Jose. What are you hearing from some of the other candidates right now?
Well, what struck me was that immediately.
Sorry,
go ahead, Alex.
Go ahead, Melanie.
I just have to say that what struck me was that immediately we started seeing the dueling polls. Alex, I'm sure you saw them too, from the two campaigns that were trying to say that they were best positioned to pick up those Swalwell supporters. And so I think we'll start seeing that spin kind of ramp up over the next couple of days.
Yeah, Alex, are there any early indications of who may gain momentum here?
Well, all the campaigns are trying to spin that. So Melanie this morning had reporting that Matt Mahan, the mayor of San Jose, reported that he raised $10 million over the weekend, just after the Swalwell news broke, trying to show that he's got momentum. Javier Becerra's campaign trying to show that he's got momentum. Now, let's be clear, Anderson. This thing has been an open secret and whispered about amongst the campaigns for months, that this Swalwell thing could break. And we have both talked to campaigns who have said off the record, part of the reason that they stayed in the race, even though their poll numbers were low, was that they were expecting that there could be this big story that breaks about Eric Swalwell that knocks him out of the race and that gives them all a fresh start. So all these campaigns sort of think that this is a new opportunity for people to look at them, but they don't have much time. I mean, we've got a debate on May 5th here on CNN. There's a few other debates that are scheduled. But remember, in California, you got a month to vote. Everybody who's registered is mailed a ballot. So people will start voting within a few weeks.
Melanie, was it that big of an open secret?
Well, I will say that Alex is exactly right. This is precisely why all of these Democrats, even the ones who were polling at 1%, 2%, were refusing to get out of the race, because I think that there was an anticipation that something would be happening. We just dropped a behind the scenes story here at Politico about how the last few months unfolded. That included the fact that there were political operatives that were putting on social media as early as December that there were rumors out there. Now, this tweet was promptly erased, but I can tell you that it circulated a lot among the campaigns. It circulated a lot among lobbyists and other people who would be sort of endorsers in this race. And so I think that there was not necessarily clarity about what would come out or even if something would come out. And I will say that I don't think any of the rumors touched on the severity of some of the reporting that your colleagues at CNN did. But I think that there was some sort of anticipation that something would emerge.
I mean, Alex, if the allegations are true, the fact that he would stake a race, I mean, that he would run, it's kind of breathtaking.
If they're true, and then the question is, did he think that this was all consensual? And now his attorney, when I pushed his attorney on Friday night on CNN on that point of, was this him cheating on his wife? But he thought that it was consensual. He wouldn't get into the details of that. And Swalwell hasn't said that. Earlier in the week, he said that he had never behaved inappropriate with staffers. That changed over the days. But you wonder sort of what was going on in his mind. Possibly he thought it was consensual, and possibly he thought that many of these women had come back and supported him. And so he didn't think maybe there was going to be a problem.
And Melanie, the margins are thin in the House. How will his seat be filled?
I think we're still waiting to see. Governor Newsom has the ability to call a special election. We're also so close to the June primary that there might be consolidation. But I do think that one of the conversations that had been going on prior to Swalwell's resignation was, would there be kind of a one for one? There's a lot of chatter on the Republican side about Congressman Tony Gonzalez, and if he should step down for some of the stories that have since come out about him. So I do wonder, with, as you said, the margins being so tight, do Democrats push on that further now that they're down one more vote? I still think that people are trying to make a sense of what truly is this breaking news.
And Anderson, just on that point, there is no mechanism in California for the governor to appoint a member of the House. The governor can appoint a member of the Senate here, but not a member of the House. So that seat is going to remain open for some time. Even if the governor called a special election, the soonest that somebody could be in there is around September. So those constituents in that district are not going to have a member of Congress. And with the margins that tight, the Democrats are going to be down one vote.
And Alex, have you heard anything? I mean, has Governor Newsom said anything? Has former Vice President Kamala Harris said anything about the allegations or the primary?
Governor Newsom put out a quote saying that these are serious allegations. He did not call for Swalwell to drop out, one of the few people who didn't. We know when Governor Newsom wants to say something publicly, he is very good at getting attention for his message. He was about as low-key on this as it gets. We've not heard from Kamala Harris on this either. So it's interesting at a time when almost everybody in California politics weighed in. The two most famous members of the California political world were not very loud.
It is a stunning development. Elex Michaelson, Melanie Mason, thanks so much. Appreciate it.